Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special INN news segment. I'm your host, Collin Radix-Carter. Um, and Reef, who's normally with me, is actually working tech today.
Hi,
Um,
everyone.
but but today I'm very fortunate to have a friend and colleague in EmpowerEd, which is the teacher advocacy organization I'm affiliated with in DC. So welcome, Gabrielle. Thank you for being on our show today.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
So you are our lead facilitator. So basically you are mother to us, I would say, in terms of your role, but you are also a teacher yourself. You are a freshman teacher and writing center facilitator for Duke Ellington School of the Arts in DC. If you just want to give people just a little background as to who you are and how you came to be a teacher and how you came to Empower Ed.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity for me to share. I've been teaching for a long time, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 decades. I have experience in private, charter, and public school education. My education profession started in Maryland, and then I moved to Texas, where I was for a number of years. I've been back in the DMV, specifically at Duke Ellington, for going on 10 years now. Teaching for me is a calling. It's something that I take very seriously in terms of equity for all students, in particular teachers of color and those that are also differently able. And so I have the pleasure of teaching at Duke Ellington, which is also my alma mater. I've got background experience in the arts as well as education. And to a large extent, I do consider myself one of the integrationists who is bridging the gap between arts and academics for our students.
And can you just share how you became a part of Empower Ed?
Oh, absolutely. Don't want to leave that out. So it's in this particular time in my career, with the level of classroom experience that I do have in those areas that I mentioned before, I have a strong desire to get involved in policy writing, to impact decisions, conversations that are happening around what's going to be tailor made to happen within the classroom, whether it's elementary, middle school, or high school. I'd rather see my experience right now impact those conversations. And so Empower Ed is a jewel for me because it was my first real introduction to local education policy and how it happens in Washington, D.C. specifically. And so working with Empower Ed has afforded me not just the opportunity, Collin, to work with great teachers like you, but under the leadership of Scott Goldstein, I've had access to, again, how policy is written, what type of stance and position a teacher voice can have and should have in some of those decisions. And I'm talking about not just book knowledge, but actually through Empower Ed, going into those particular areas, whether it is having conversations with the state board or with council members. I am actually getting the opportunity, as are you and the other teachers that work with us, to really understand the nuts and bolts of education policy.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it's been wonderful to work alongside you in terms of, and we talk about in INN News all the time, is the idea of having labor be involved in what's happening locally. And so, for us as teachers, this is a great way to kind of having some privilege in kind of bringing, elevating the needs of teachers to the people that we've been actually been able to talk to, and having um, opportunities where we've been able to speak to councilmen, especially in the last few months, to talk about issues that are pertinent to teachers. And a lot of the stuff that I've been kind of sharing, seeing federally being able to elevate those
Mhm.
locally here. So
Mhm.
we stress the idea of having people being involved locally as far as having the most direct impact. And
Yeah.
Empower Ed for us has been a way, given our profession, that we've been able to do that. So
Right.
again, once again, we talked about having you on for a while.
Okay.
So we're very happy that we're able to have you on as an example of, how you can use your giftings to work within the local sector.
Yes.
Um,
Great.
so I wanted to talk to you. Well, this is an issue that we're collectively in the Power Ed talk talking about in terms of teacher retention.
Yep.
Obviously, that's been, I would argue, a big topic forever, but I think especially given COVID, that issue has been exacerbated a lot more, and now it's getting federal attention to the point now where Senator Bernie Sanders very recently this week introduced a bill to raise the minimum wage pay to $60K a year. So I actually want to read that article for our viewers.
Okay.
And then we're actually, from there, we're actually going to talk more about that and kind of go into more specifics of, you know, whether or not that is this all we should consider in terms of retaining teachers in the
Sounds
field.
good.
So I'm just going to, so this article is from Truth Out, written by Sharon Zhang. So she writes, Bernie Sanders introduces bill to raise minimum teacher pay to $60K. And she writes, Senator Bernie Sanders introduced a bill on Thursday that takes a crack at ending a crisis that has long plagued the U.S. education system: extremely low teacher pay. Sanders, the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, has proposed setting a nationwide minimum wage for teachers at $60,000 a year. This would raise the salaries of 43% of public school teachers in the country, according to a press release on the bill, affecting over 1 million school teachers. The senator says that the bill is necessary to fix the international embarrassment of the U.S. having among the worst pay for teachers across wealthy countries. It is simply unacceptable that in the richest country in the history of the world, many teachers are having to work 2 or 3 extra jobs just to make ends meet, Sanders said in a statement. The situation has become so absurd that the top 15 hedge fund managers on Wall Street make more money in a single year than every kindergarten teacher in America combined. Over 112,000 teachers. Wages for the public school teachers are so low that in 36 states, the average public school teacher with a family of 4 qualifies for food stamps, public housing, and other government assistance programs, he continued, emphasizing that the U.S. attitude towards education must radically change. On top of raising teacher salaries, the Pay Teachers Act would increase federal support for public schools, tripling assistance for schools with large numbers of low-income students, and upping funding for rural schools and the Bureau of Indian Education. The bill has been co-sponsored by 7 senators, including Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey. It also has the support of more than 50 major education groups and unions, including the 2 largest teacher unions in the U.S., the National Education Association and American Federation for Teachers. America's schools are facing a 5-alarm crisis because of the educator shortages that have been decades in the making and exacerbated by the pandemic, said ENA President Becky Pringley. Together, we must recruit large number of diverse educators into the profession and retain qualified and experienced educators in our schools to support our students in learning recovery and thriving in today's world. To do that, we must have competitive career-based pay to recruit and retain educators. The field of education is currently in crisis. The gap between teacher pay and that of other college graduates has hit a record high. According to a report by the Economic Policy Institute, teachers were paid on average 24% less than comparable college graduates were paid in 2021, a record high gap since the group began examining such data. Historic low pay for teachers has contributed to over a decade-long teacher shortage, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. According to a survey by the National Center for Education Statistics, 53% of public schools felt they were understaffed for the 2022-2023 school year. Understaffing, caused by large part by underpay, is eroding the state of the profession overall. A recent study found that teacher pay, working conditions, decreasing union influence, and increases in school shootings have caused the profession to be at its lowest point in at least half a century, judging by the metrics of education funding. On top of worsening working conditions, teachers are facing an increase in attacks and harassment from standing right-wing parent movements orchestrated by money far-right groups seeking to erode and destroy the public school system in the U.S. Teachers have risen up in response to low pay and poor conditions across the country with teacher strikes increasing in recent years, often garnering good outcomes. But in many states, public school teachers aren't allowed to strike, and in 5 states across the South and Southwest, public employees aren't even allowed to collectively bargain without facing retaliation. Oh, so that's it.
That is
So
packed full of so much information,
yeah,
data.
so I want to ask you, and it's funny asking you because I know the answer to this, but I don't want to be biased here. Is this enough, in your opinion, that we focus on just teacher pay in terms of retaining teachers?
So, let me first say that I applaud Senator Sanders and others. You mentioned with the American Teachers Act, that's also being touted by Wilson and Bowman, Wilson out of Florida, Bowman out of New York. And so kudos to them for continuously raising the issue about pay parity issues for teachers at the national level. And wanting to introduce bills that will bring in that 61,000 median for teachers to begin their careers with, and hopefully bring others who've been in the profession up to that level. Or in order for them to have, competitive salaries with which to live normal lives, to live their version of the American dream, while they're also helping to shape present and future minds. That's critical to where this country is going in the future. Is the pay situation, pay raise, pay increase enough to retain teachers who know that this is the area of work that they're called to this particular time? No, it's not enough to be able to, again, live at a competitive salary. That's a great beginning in terms of respecting the profession of teaching, but it doesn't end there. In some instances, some might even say to increase the pay salary is the easiest way to go about elevating the profession of teaching, right? Because the other areas, and you're familiar with this, Collin, as we have done so much on the groundwork and talking with teachers, hearing from them directly, the other areas that teachers are saying would cause them to be retained in this profession goes beyond the money itself.
Yeah, yeah. So why should people care? Because I think the argument is, okay, well, teachers get paid enough. So why should people be concerned or in regards to, this issue in general?
Mm-hmm. So, good question. It's one thing for the teacher community and those in the education community to be concerned about retaining effective and highly effective teachers in the profession. That's one thing. Something that cannot be ignored, that unfortunately oftentimes is ignored, is that these students are members of the community, whether it's urban communities or in the suburbs. And so these students, as they graduate, like post high school, they will begin to shape neighborhoods and what's going on within the neighborhoods. They will shape the workplace. They'll shape the marketplace. And so this is not just a teacher or education community issue. This is something that should concern society as a whole if we are truly interested in re-envisioning. Like, there's a lot of things that the pandemic taught us as we were all, holed up inside our respective homes, etc. And we noticed that life itself was able to go on without some of the hustle bustle. Then what came out of that, whether it's in the education sector or government or corporate, is that we have to reimagine how we as a society, an American society, have been doing things. And one of those things includes educating our children and being concerned that we have qualified teachers remain in the classroom, because teachers help to shape minds. And as I mentioned, these students will not always be in high school. They're going to graduate, and they're going to be your neighbor. They're going to be the folks that you are involved with in the retail stores, etc., or in government offices and corporate. And so this is a national concern to make certain that our young people are getting access to a competitive critical thinking training through their education, so that when they do graduate high school and go on into trade school or 2-year college or 4-year college, they are prepared to meet education at knowledge at that level and then to grow beyond. I could go on and on about the concerns we have nationally in terms of where our young people are missing the mark. And for example, China is outpacing us in technology and all these other areas and things. And so when we unpack that and work backwards, we take it back to the classroom itself to make certain that we have qualified, effective, and highly effective teachers who are being respected in their profession, and that are not only able to receive a competitive salary so they can live and take care of their own lives, but they're also receiving other wellness opportunities so that we can retain them and they can have these great teachable moments and teaching relationships with students.
Right. So, so we talk specifically, Empower Ed is tied to DC. So besides low pay, what are the issues that, and we can talk about it in terms of DC, but there may be some issues that might translate into other states and cities across the country. What are the issues that, and I'm asking you, but I know as well, like,
Right.
what are some of the issues that I think we've been finding that you want to, that you can share as to why teachers are leaving the profession that are unique to our city, but may align with other cities and states as well?
Well, as we have conversations within Empower Ed, and we know that we have fellows and teacher fellows in Empower Ed that work in the charter sector and DCPS. And so we have great conversations and we share our real life experiences in terms of what's challenging in the classroom that needs to be addressed so that, we as teachers can remain in the profession. We also host many surveys across all 8 wards in the city, whether it's us going directly to the schools and handing out flyers for teachers to click the QR code and participate and give their input that way. We make certain that we are hearing the voice of teachers across the district-wide. And so some of those particular issues I think you're asking about that teachers are saying themselves would keep them in the classroom, I sort of divided my notes here from charter versus public schools or versus DCPS. And so for the charter teachers, interestingly, at the top is the pay disparity that exists between charter teachers and DCPS, and the lack of transparency with the public charter board in terms of posting what those annual salaries are and where the growth span, is within those numbers. And also from the charter teachers being overworked and not really having as much of the teacher resources, i.e. Substitute teachers, assistants, etc., which of course goes across charter school and DCPS, and a lack of resources that, teachers need in order to keep the learning process going within their classrooms. And so that's under my notes with regards to charter teachers. Under DCPS at the top, one of the top issues teachers are saying needs to be addressed is the lack of flexibility. And teachers being interested in having funding specifically targeted towards teachers and schools being able to create flexible schedules. And so under flexible scheduling for teachers, there's a lot that falls within that falls under that heading. When there's more flexibility for teachers, then teachers can have more access to planning time for our classes. I'm going to digress here for just a second and say that in my own experience, I've come out of a classroom setting with students when I was teaching English, and I have all these great ideas for this particular class as far as small group and developing those groups and being able to address and differentiate material for my students for the next class. But before I know it, I'm called into a meeting. I'm called away from that space and place that I was in where I need to go in and directly write down my notes for planning for the next period, but I'm called away from that. And so I'm asked then to shift hats and go into a different setting. Well, when I come back to planning, some of those ideas that were like organic and in the moment, they're gone, from me. And so getting back to my list with DCPS teachers, there is a disruption to the creative plan of flowing, or the flow to plan well, again, when there's a lack of flexibility for DCPS teachers. So flexible scheduling. In addition to that, these same teachers have said that they desire to have more access to be able to manage their own wellness. There's a whole wellness movement across the country, but unfortunately in education, there hasn't been enough specific focus on giving teachers the opportunity to have a wellness coordinator on campus.
Right.
And that wellness coordinator helping to coordinate wellness plans specific to each campus and what that looks like for those teachers as well. And under wellness, or over top of wellness, there's also flexible scheduling. And all of this sort of centers around respecting time, the time that teachers need to prepare lessons and prepare themselves to be in front of the students who are, the open audience to receive the lessons and to actually engage in learning opportunities. But I dare not leave this topic without also mentioning some of the teachers have responded with regards to reforming impact,
So,
which is the evaluation system that DCPS uses. Yeah.
yeah. So I do want to kind of add, in terms of mental health, because I think that's been a huge topic in like the pandemic. And I think the idea of why we're mentioning this is because, I think more so this year, we've just kind of returned to, okay, we're out of the pandemic now. Everything's back to normal now. We're going to do things as they were pre-lockdowns 2020. And the reality is, and we could say this, for DC, the idea that we went through a pandemic with our students is acknowledged in terms of rhetoric, but not necessarily as far as practice, where if anything, they're trying to play catch up in the mind of, learning loss, that we're not given time to consider the needs of our students who are coming in, with the trauma of having to go 3 years without contact with their peers in a way that's fulfilling. And I'm just speaking in terms for me in early childhood, but you can also apply that to the older grades as well. We have students who really don't know how to be a student in a typical way because they were virtual. And so there's a lot of trauma just within those two examples of not necessarily being addressed. In addition, the idea of that trauma, what they're bringing into the classroom now. And just for me, on a personal level, I've seen a lot more social and behavior issues that probably in my 20 years of being in the field that I've experienced, because I believe there's been a lot that my students, some of them, have been through that have not been properly addressed. And given the shortages that we have in DCPS right now, we're not necessarily really equipped to deal with these challenges in a way that's a lot more holistic to the child's overall health in terms of mentally, but also in terms of how to kind of make sense of what has happened in the last few years and being able to move forward in terms of how can we adjust to what we've all collectively been through in the age of COVID. I just feel like there's been a lot that hasn't been addressed. And you have to question why that is, in terms of why are we moving in a status quo state of mind versus a reformist, or at least a more radical change of thinking of what have we learned and what our children need right now that we have to adjust to in terms of thinking differently of how we educate our students.
Yeah, if I may jump in right here, I mean, you said so much that I still have where I still have flexible scheduling like in the back of my mind, right? Because I remember during COVID, during the lockdown, where there was somewhat of a flexible schedule with our classes. And it was beneficial during the lockdown period of time. And then when we were, as many other school districts across the country were called back in full time, and that flexibility went away,
Right.
which was extremely confusing for me and for many teachers, because the conversation in the district, and again, other cities and states across the country, was that our students suffered learning loss, and that it was especially egregious for students who were in low income areas. And so we as teachers knew from the very beginning of being called back in full time that we were not going to be able to adequately address those learning loss issues for our students if we were called back into the same rigorous, mandated, demanding schedule as we had prior to COVID, which in many instances wasn't working for our children who were furthest from opportunity anyway. And so I'm going to just say here that to allow flexible scheduling and to allow space and room for teachers to be able to not only plan engaging lessons that would help to recover some of that learning loss, but allowing teachers to also process their own lives, because like the students experienced the pandemic, so did teachers, right? And so when we're talking about reimagining education, that's huge, because this public school education system has been in place since the early 1900s.
Right.
And so we've been asked from that time until just before COVID to sort of force all kids to fit within that structure or that mantra. We could have a whole conversation for 6 days and 7 months about how that doesn't work for children who are furthest from opportunity.
Right.
So imagine now, and we've lived this, we've been asked to go back to that same structure without any reimagining actually happening. It's one thing to say it, but it's another thing to actually allow LEAs and school districts to independently look at their district, look at their school campuses, and create a schedule with flexibility where teachers really have time to have small group settings with students,
Right.
and can really differentiate and have the one-to-one time. So we're talking about asking at a national level for it to, first of all, become legislation and then trickle down to the states and have it protected so that school districts can really allow teachers to do the job of teaching.
Right.
And to not only be what our students need for us, but to also have time to see to our own needs. Because when I stand in front of my students, I need to be my whole authentic self. And so I need flexibility to be able to manage what's going on in my own life. And at the same time, if I'm allowed that as an educator, I can also teach my students how to manage stresses that are in their lives. If I have the flexibility to go into these spaces for self, and then flexibility to actually bring my students into this same space. Think about it. We are with our students oftentimes more than their parents are.
Mm-hmm.
As educators.
Right.
And so unless and until we begin to seriously roll our sleeves up and dig deep into this work, it's not just about a higher salary, but unless and until we are actually willing to, as a nation, allow the education profession to go into some of these areas of flexibility and wellness, if we don't allow that to happen, then it's really all just talk.
Right. So we talked about this in terms of teachers, of what it could look like for them. Can you share a little bit more of what, in your mind, it would look like for students under this model? You can speak, I can speak a little more in terms of elementary if you want to kind of try for high school, since that's your expertise.
So you raise a good point, and I'm going to refer to one of our students who participated in a conversation we had about a week or so ago. Empower Ed hosted an event where the flexible scheduling report was released to the public. And one of our students from Duke Ellington, April Kilpatrick, did an outstanding job. I wouldn't even try, Collin, to repeat all of what this young lady shared. It was very vivid and steeped in evidence as a DCPS student. She's been in the DCPS system her entire school life. And so now she's at Duke Ellington. And what I will say is that April mentioned for high schoolers needing to and wanting to participate in internships, and high schoolers that need to actually have a part-time job to help with, financial matters at home. If it's not broad-based, a wide, broad swath of flexible scheduling being accessible to high school students, then it's frustrating for them, because what they have on their minds is, yes, I'm closing out this chapter of high school for my life, and I'm also at the same time thinking about where I'm going next.
Mhm.
And so, as a nation, we owe it to our high school students to give them access to internships that are going to matter, right? Whether they're going to the facility to conduct the internship or participate in it, or if we're having community members from corporations and government agencies coming into the school to host real life scenarios and situations for our students. We owe that to them. And so to build in flexible timing and scheduling for high schoolers, according to April, and I agree with her, is critical to where the world is going, where the future of this world is going. Everything is techie.
Yeah,
It's not what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but we still have those models in place, and we'll pretend like, oh, yes, we are preparing our students for the future. Are we really? Are
right,
we really allowing education the space to make certain that we are doing that? I would beg to differ.
right. And I think in speaking to that, it gives more equity in terms of students having in high school, having the means to kind of figure out what their options are as far as a career.
Right.
And I
Mhm.
think in some certain cases, if deciding, if college is for them, then they have the means to figure that out. But some jobs may not necessarily require a college degree. If it means going into a trade, then they have the opportunity to do that. I just find that I think typically you would see something like this more in the private school sector,
Mhm.
in terms of the access that those students have to maybe kind of dabbling in these
Mhm.
opportunities when they're in high school versus public school,
Sure.
and usually no income that may not have those
That's right.
opportunities, and
That's
then
right.
often having to guess, oh, I might go into this without having the
That's right.
experience or the know-how to kind of make a decision of whether or not that's right for them, which would affect in terms of them going to college,
Mhm.
being unsure or going in undecided and trying to figure out for two, or in some cases more than that, trying to
Mhm.
figure out what they want to do, or
Mhm.
using grad school as a means to shift careers. So
Yeah.
it gives, especially
Mhm.
older students, the opportunity to really test out their giftings and
Mhm.
seeing if it's compatible to what they want to do.
Mhm.
And speaking just more on the elementary side, and I was able to do this with the that year. So that was 2020, 21
Mhm.
school year. Um, I was among the first to go in person. So I kind of started that fall part-time, 1 day a week, where there was a need. A lot families were saying, we need our kids to be able, like, interact
Mhm.
in person.
Yeah.
Because I worked with the babies, I worked with pre-K students. They can't sit at a computer for,
That's right. Oh my
like,
goodness.
yeah, and like the idea for me being on the computer with them for 20 minutes at a time and then logging off and then having them on and logging off, it was very strenuous to me. But more
Mhm.
importantly, they may not have the opportunity to interact and play together.
Right.
So fortunately at the time it was kind of a pilot, but just testing the idea of outdoor education. Unfortunately, I had the means to do this at my school where I was able to do like with coordination with our gardening teacher, uh, for small groups of kids to come on campus for like a structured play date for
Mhm.
about an hour and a half for because I did two groups. Um, so which connected to gardening. So they were able to play collectively on the playground a little bit, and then we had like a structured lesson where they were able to go into gardens and like do some work there.
Mhm.
And then they would go home where they will do their specials virtually,
Mhm.
but that allowed me the time to whether if I wanted to go home and do my prep slash um, meetings or grade level meetings that we would have, or
Mhm.
but if I was able to do that, then it will offer me
Mhm.
more flexibility in terms
Mhm.
of having more time because right now I barely have enough planning time and actually haven't had any
Mhm.
um, grade level teaching time really all year, honestly. I just started to have it maybe like within the last month.
Mhm.
Um, but it offered me more time to actually connect with my team
Yes. Yep.
virtually, and being able to have more time to really talk about what we were doing in the
Yes.
classroom. So I just find that, as you said, we need to reimagine what education looks like. And it's not strange, but I think it's very interesting that the idea of having flexible scheduling or working from home has now become a lot more accepted thing. And
Mhm.
not to say that teachers should be doing that
Mhm.
necessarily, but the idea of having more flexibility in terms of how the day is structured so that
Mhm.
you have more time to plan, you have more time to meet with students, you have more time
Right.
to take care of yourself if you needed to. I
Yeah.
do believe that there should be a larger discussion in terms of how
Absolutely.
we manage ourselves and how we manage our students and prepare them more effectively in terms of, having a more robust education that meets whole child than we would have time for during the day.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. And so you make me think about also with the great example you gave of flexibility that you had access to before we were called back in full time. I'm understanding more and more about this resource called community schools and connected schools. Are you familiar with what those are in the district, DCPS? Yeah. So some of them fall under DCPS directly, like community schools may be under DCPS, whereas connected schools are under OSSI. Essentially, these resources are the same. Again, some schools in the district can access the resource, which they're both wraparound services for students, right? And so they can either be accessed through DCPS directly as schools apply to become a connected school, or they can apply through OSSI to become a community school. And
So
so,
just
yeah.
pause 1 second. So for those who may not be in DC, can you describe Aussie?
So OSSI stands for the Office of State Superintendent, and
Yeah.
that is the state office in the District of Columbia that makes certain that the mandates, if you will, that come down through the Department of Education are adhered to within the district.
So basically it's our oversight committee,
Yes,
basically in terms
yes,
of, just for people who are watching this who may not be teachers and
understood.
especially specific to DC, just want to make that
Yes,
clarification for them. But
thank you
thank
for
you for
that.
clarifying that.
No problem. When you gave the example of the gardening, access that your little babies could experience because they were back in in-person learning, well, connected and community schools can bring gardening and other types of wraparound services into the school. whether it's elementary, middle school, or high school. And
Right.
so for me at the high school level, if Duke Ellington, for example, was to apply for funding to become one of those schools to have the wraparound services come to Duke Ellington, there could be outside groups, whether it's IT, some of the corporations, or policy, writing and whatever it is that our students in history and civics have interest in, our students in English, even our students on the performing arts side, would, if we had access to become one of those schools to bring in wraparound resources to our students, then we could have outside groups come in once a week, maybe half a day. And the students who are, students students across the building could have access to some of these professional organizations coming on campus
Mhm.
during the school day and hosting workshops and real life scenarios, etc., for our students to do exactly what you said. Give our students an opportunity to tap into some of these professions before they graduate high school, to find out if they really do have interest in pursuing this trade school or 2-year college or 4-year college as their major, as opposed to waiting until they get into those environments and learn, oh my gosh, I need to change my major because it's not what I thought. Right. And if we can bring those outside groups, wraparound services, if you will, on campus, and that frees up the teacher's time to do exactly what you said, have more grade level meetings,
Right.
have more planning time for the next time the students are with the teachers. So there's more than one way, I guess you and I are both trying to say, to educate children. It's not, they're not only educated by sitting in a classroom, for 8 hours over the course of the day and having different subject matter come at them. That is really not the best way to differentiate or even create differentiation opportunities for our students. So when we free ourselves up to really genuinely reimagine how education is being done. And that's part of the reason why you and I are talking today, because teachers have a lot of ideas and solutions
Right.
to get at this. And what we want in DC and across the country is for teachers to be respected, our voice and the solutions that we offer to actually enter into real discussions about policy, etc., so that what we know will matter and make a difference in our schools actually comes to pass.
Right. I'm actually glad you brought that up because I do want to go back to Impact, which is in DC. That's our, at least for DCPS, our teacher evaluation system, because I think a lot of it falls under that umbrella in terms of, having teachers, and we've talked about this before, having teachers, um, the way I phrase it, controlling the means of what is happening in their classrooms in terms of knowing their students, knowing the community, knowing their school,
Yeah.
to actually have more of a voice in terms of what they want their teaching to look like, in terms of seeing the gaps, especially if you're experienced, seeing the gaps of what your students need, and then tailoring your evaluation based around how you're trying to fill those needs. Because not every school is different. Every school is different. Every classroom is different. And there's going to be different needs. And we talk about this because that's been, I think, especially in DC, the huge elephant in the room that no one wants to touch, because it is tied to our chancellor and our mayor. And so there is a lot of, I would argue, a lot of corporate interest there in terms of, maintaining the status quo and using um, impact as a punitive measure, um, to have teachers kind of fall in line in terms of what the district is asking teachers to do. But the issue that I have of it, it's almost kind of like a one size fits all approach, which we know this doesn't work. In terms of what might work in one school may not work in another. And so the idea that we're proposing is, again, I think the reality is that there's not much we can do on a legislative level, right? At least right now, in regards to changing our evaluation system here. But
Mhm.
what we are proposing for In Life Empower Ed is having a task force that consists of different stakeholders within the district
Mhm.
that are able to research more on what is a more equitable evaluation system that could be studied, um, and that could be piloted to see how well it will work in terms of having teachers. It, ultimately, it'll be the idea of having teachers have more of a say, but giving the means of having teachers have their voices heard in terms of them determining what their essentially what their evaluation should look like in terms of what they want to focus on,
Mhm.
what is happening in their schools. And
Yeah.
we say that in terms of they're not just doing this alone, just picking something, that obviously there has to be guidelines as to what should be
Mhm.
evaluated on. But within that framework, giving teachers more flexibility in terms of, talking to their principal and saying,
Mhm.
I noticed, for example, I noticed that my students are, I'm just going to give an example, like we noticed based on data that our students are this need to work on reading or math or whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
And talking to the principal about, I want to be able to work on this, and this is how I want to do this, which relates to professional development, and having more flexibility in terms of what their professional development, if needed, would look like. Because right now, and I just had PD or professional development Friday, and it was worthless to me. Like, I hate saying that, but it's almost kind of like they do it because they know they have to do it, but it's not necessarily stuff. This is stuff that the stuff that they went over there on Friday is more of a regurgitation of stuff that I've heard over and over and over and over and over again. So it almost feels like you want us to do this and you're not valuing our time because it's not worth it. It's almost kind of degrading in a sense of
Mhm.
having teachers go through stuff that, especially if you're experienced, we know.
Mhm.
And but to have that repetitive, similar topics, that they just repeat each session.
Yes.
Whereas if I was able to say, I've heard about this PD in terms of this, like issue or subject matter, I want to be able to have the flexibility to go to that, or if the district is able to
Mhm.
offer that, or if I
Mhm.
know teachers in other places that have had this training that I'm able to
Mhm.
go to.
Mhm.
So there'll be more, to me, there'll be more worth in having teachers have more of a voice in
Mhm.
terms of what, how they want to be evaluated. You see that in almost every single industry in terms
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
employees working with their supervisor and working with them
Mhm.
to figure out how they can improve. And
Mhm.
in many cases, in many public school districts, you don't necessarily see that.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about reimagining, right?
Right.
And we can go back to the fear that exists when you talk about reimagining, reframing systems that have been in place forever.
Hmm.
And that, quite frankly, were put in place without people that look like you and I in mind.
Right.
And so, when we bring innovation to the table, to policymakers, it's like talking to a brick wall because what's in running through their mind, it seems, is that, but this is how it's always been, and so this is how it's supposed to remain.
Right.
And yet we work with real life people, young people whose minds are growing and shaping and forming. And so to meet students really where they are shouldn't be, or teachers, quite frankly, to have everybody fit within the same mold. If that mold is not working, if that mold, needs to be updated, then there should be the freedom and flexibility to do so. With regards to impact, and I agree with you, we've had great conversations. And in fact, you and I actually wrote an op-ed about reforming impact. But I had a conversation recently with a principal about it, and it was an interesting comment that the principal made, which is the tool itself, impact, is not meant to be punitive
Right,
and not meant to be egregious. It depends on the teacher, the principal administrator who is conducting the actual evaluation. They can weaponize that tool and turn it into something that it was not meant to be,
right,
which is why it's imperative that teachers have conversations with council, with the chancellor's office, with the mayor's office to say, these are the practices that are going on in my school regarding impact. Take a look at my evaluation. Let's talk about how I know it was not a fair evaluation, that
right,
I didn't have the input, et cetera, that I should have had at the top of the school year so that I had a map or a roadmap that I was following. I didn't have the check-ins over the course of the school year that I should have had. Instead, everything happened at the end on the back end, and I'm told that I'm ineffective. And it doesn't make sense. It's not congruent.
right,
But unless teachers continue to have these conversations that we have at Empower Ed, and unless teachers feel like they're empowered to address these issues with their teachers, and it's not going to change. The status quo will remain in place,
right,
right? So a lot of it too, this work we're talking about with regards to teacher retention, teachers have to get on board too and join the coalition, because there's strength in unity in numbers.
right. I do want to talk about that probably at the end because I think that's a very important. And I think actually,
Okay.
funny enough, we talked about this at our meeting this week, in terms
Mhm.
of charter schools and a measure that our mayor is, essentially just giving money to charter schools in DC
Yeah.
uh, in the mindset of our fight in public schools to get a raise,
Yeah.
at a very
Yes.
basic level, and the willingness just to give it to charter schools just because, which
Mhm.
we don't want to fault the teachers at all because you just mentioned typically charter school teachers are paid less than
Mhm.
public school, like they work longer for less, which
Mhm.
we don't want to definitely don't want to exclude them.
Mhm.
That being said, it's the idea of we've had to fight for that right, essentially,
Yeah.
which charter schools teachers don't necessarily didn't have to do.
Mhm.
So I do want to talk to you of just of what that can look like at the end, but I
Mhm.
do want you to kind of go through. So we talked about, like flexible scheduling, and we talked about evaluation systems,
Mhm.
which I do think can translate into other districts as well.
Mhm.
Are there any other issues that you feel that as part of the teacher retention that should
Mhm.
be considered, or at least should be talked about in terms of, how can we ensure that teachers, once they're in, are more likely to stay in the field?
Mhm. I think you hit on one of the important points in addition to flexible scheduling, which is mental health, which falls under the heading of wellness. And so, something we're trying to get done in the district, which can happen across the country, is having protected mental health days become a part of a teacher's portfolio. Or in addition to sick days, we also have at least two mental health days that teachers can call in and say, "I'm taking a mental health day this day," and have no fear of retaliation. So
Nice.
teachers being able to manage their mental health by having access to bona fide days that protects and covers them too. They don't have to take the whole day at a time. And maybe it's a half a day they want to take. Maybe they'll leave 2 hours early because it was a very stressful day and they need to have access. Now, that opens up a whole different conversation in terms of substitute coverage. That is an area
Right.
that teachers are clamoring about, will help them to stay in the profession if every school has, let's say, 2 permanent substitutes, maybe 3, that will access teacher classrooms when the teachers do need to be out. That too, it falls under flexible scheduling, it falls under teacher wellness, and it also creates more of an opportunity for those who want to be in the substitute profession for whatever reason is happening for them at home. It may not be the time or season for them because they're growing a young family, but they need to work and bring an income, so they can, become hired to become a permanent substitute teacher at a school. All of these things that we're talking about, that yes, they are specific to DC, but can also make an impact in schools across the country. And then with that wellness work, every school being able to have the funding to hire a wellness coordinator. Now, we're doing some wellness work at Empower Ed, and what it amounts to, I'll say it really as quickly as I can, is schools receiving funding to create a wellness community and environment in their school, and having a wellness coordinator who's at the helm of helping to coordinate that work. And so one of the things that falls under wellness, Collin, at the school level on the school campus is more what you were talking about, more teacher-centered PDs that teachers have access to design and create PDs that are specific to their campus and helps meet the needs that the teachers have professionally, as opposed to sitting in a day-long PD session and you walk away with nothing added
Right.
to what you need in the classroom.
Right.
What can also become a part of a wellness community at a school is teachers being able to form more teams and coalitions to work together to just build community, perhaps working on visual art, painting a mural together on the wall, doing some type of an artistic project, that there has to be flexibility within the teacher's schedule for them to get at that. But when that happens, walls of separatism and division can be brought down between departments, if you will, and the community can begin to gel as one, and then they'll take that unified presence into the classroom with them.
Right.
So what wellness looks like at my school is going to look different from what it looks like at your school. Wellness will look different perhaps for schools in DC than it will look for schools in Florida or California or Minnesota. But part of the nationwide conversation should not just be the pay parity, but also teachers having access to flexible scheduling, teachers having access to wellness programs, et cetera.
Right. I do want to highlight the Grow Your Own program. So just to kind of describe it quickly, it's an initiative that has been very big, and shout out to many of our advocates and Empower Ed who have really pushed for this for years. Especially many of them are paraprofessionals themselves, who at least initially were paraprofessionals, who really pushed for this initiative. But it's the idea of allowing high school students and paraprofessionals to become licensed educators, to go to certain schools within the district without any debt or low debt, which is more or less a way for them to get into school to teach at in DCPS. So the council funded $1.3 million towards this a couple of years ago. And just for somebody who did not quite a program like that, but I did a teacher residency program when I was in grad school. Number one, I loved the program because I was out of school the whole year. I took many of my classes at the school, like because my mentor was a licensed professor. So she taught many of the classes at my school, and then the rest I took at the actual university. Shout out to Lesley University in Cambridge, Mass. But I taught at that school as an associate teacher for the whole year. So I had the experience of working out of school, getting involved in the community that entire year. And good thing is because I was a teacher of color, they actually gave me a scholarship and paid me, which is rare, to do that.
Absolutely.
So I just feel, and thinking about it in terms of how you consider in the medical field, they do something
Mhm.
similar. It's the idea, well, why not teachers do something similar to that?
Mhm.
Um, but as we talked about before, the idea of having high school students who might be interested in education,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
the idea of getting them that exposure early so that they can kind of see. And then, one of the big things is obviously, teachers are going into debt, you know.
Yes.
So the idea of having it low cost or free of charge to ensure that teachers are going into the profession with no debt.
Mhm.
So that's one less thing that they have that can be taken away in
Mhm.
terms of having teachers feeling fulfilled in terms of being in the profession of not having debt on their back,
Yes,
uh,
absolutely.
not having taking going to a second and third job just to make ends meet.
Mhm.
Um, so I do want to kind of swing around and talk about as our last question. And I think this is more just in general. Thinking about, I think again, we're very fortunate in DC that there are groups like ours and a lot of advocacy in education on the ground here where we're able to elevate these issues so that, we're privileged in that regard that
Mhm.
I think given where we are, that we do have exposure to our legislators in the
Yes.
city and being able to
Mhm.
talk to them openly and not always agree, but at least having that conversation with them in terms of what
Mhm.
teachers need.
Mhm.
There are a lot of other cities and states who do not have what we have. But I do believe that there is a call right now, especially in terms of, I think we've seen a lot more um, a rise in labor. We've seen a lot more teachers striking, which I think is a good thing.
Yes.
Um, to kind as a way to get return the control that I believe is owed to them.
Mhm. Mhm.
What advice, and I'm saying this especially for in part for charter schools as well,
Mhm.
in this, in your opinion, what advice would you give for those teachers who know the
Yeah.
problems, experience them, they may not have the means to speak up and speak out,
Mhm.
um, but being able to take those first steps in terms of advocating for themselves and advocating for their colleagues in order to have some of that power back in
Mhm.
terms of how our students should be educated.
So it's a good question that you ask, and my heart actually goes out to our school districts where there aren't any Empower Ed organizations, and where the local legislative bodies are not seemingly accessible to the teachers. I think as an educator, what I would suggest is that, first of all, podcasts like these are made and that they begin to permeate YouTube and other social media outlets so that those teachers who are looking for answers, looking for help, looking for ways out can become informed and hopefully become empowered to begin to reach out to their colleagues and put groups and coalitions together. I think there's an amount of boldness that has to happen for those teachers, which can happen if they begin to reach outside of their communities for help and look for help. And so the internet should offer a plethora of helps for these teachers. They have to do their own research and become informed and then begin to reach out horizontally to their peers within their school buildings, within their school districts, to form groups and coalitions who will then perhaps seek out some media coverage once they have their organizing, down and together, and they've reached out to organizing organizations like Empower Ed to help them begin to organize. They too can then take on larger platforms to make what's going on in their particular small towns and cities become more well known because they're not alone is really the crux of it, is really the truth of it, right? And so as teachers, what we do is we educate. And so education doesn't begin and end with students. It can continue on into adults, right? And so I think you and I would encourage those teachers to reach out through social media and find groups and organizations that are right in their town, perhaps they weren't aware of, or in neighboring towns, and begin to build those relationships and work together so that teacher voice in those areas like we're going after in DC can be strengthened and can be heard and can begin to make a difference.
Right. So, and we're just going to, and anyone who's watching, uh, who may not have any of these resources, you can connect with us at Empower Ed. And I mean, we've like we do have the resources at this point, so that we're willing to share that, and
Yeah.
we're willing to talk to people, anyone who's interested. And I think especially if you're in DC and you're a teacher, we would love
Yes,
for you to be a part of the work that
absolutely.
we're doing, because we definitely need more hands and voices in terms of, and I think especially over the past few years, I think we're definitely making some more impact than I think we've ever had in
Mhm.
terms of addressing the issues that we have as teachers and uplifting them. But we
Mhm.
definitely need a lot more as we continue to figure out, as you say, to
Yeah.
reimagine what
Mhm.
our education should look like for our students post-pandemic, and what that entails for us as well as our students and our schools. And to kind of talk about that, we do want to highlight our teacher summit. So Reef, if you don't mind pulling that up real quick, we are having a teacher summit if you're in the DC area, um, that we would love to invite anyone who's interested to come in and check us out. So Gabrielle and I will be there, and then a lot of our other colleagues in the organization, and then special guest speakers will be speaking at this. So this will be just a way to kind of highlight issues as we talked about, and then other issues that we haven't discussed. So if you're around, if you're in the area, we would love for you to stop by and hear us out and start planning ahead for our future. And I'll leave the links to the description of this for those of you who might be interested. But yeah, Gabrielle, any last words before we send you off?
Just to give a shout out to that summit as well and encourage those who are going to come to know that it's not just pomp and circumstance, but we actually offer solutions for teachers to these critical issues that we have been talking about. And we also are designing clear pathways for change to come about for teachers in the District of Columbia. And yes, a huge shout out to you, Collin and Indie News Network, for this podcast. And I know that there are even greater podcasts like this to come forth. And this is exactly what should happen. So I appreciate you and your candor and the work and time that you are, in addition to planning for your classes, you put time and attention to matters like this because they matter to you. So thank you so very much for having me today. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. And got a shout out to Empower Ed for giving me the voice
Mhm.
to do what we do, but I think in connection with that, being able to do this and being able to think in terms of the things that I hear about on the federal level, being able to strongly make that advocacy for us on a local level. So I definitely really appreciate doing this. And thank you, Gabrielle. Finally, that we've been able to have you on, and this is perfect timing,
Mhm.
for us,
Yes, right.
for being able to do this.
Mhm.
Where can people find you if they're interested in getting a hold of you or Empower Ed?
Okay. Well, our website, we are empowered.org, and my email address is Gabrielle, Gabrielle, at weareempowered.org. I am somewhat on social media. My handle on Twitter is Gabrielle. D is in Daniel, Gabrielle D1. So Gabrielle 1, and that's where I can be reached either via email or through Twitter.
Yeah. And those of you who know me, you can find my links in the description, or you can check out anynews.network to find me, and then obviously my other colleagues on the network there as well. So, but thank you so much. And as we say here, I actually got to say this, Reef, instead of you. But labels are banned. Stay independent. Have a great day, everybody, and thank you.
All right. Thank you. Now, bye bye. Take good care. Bye bye.